I never thought I'd end up in a situation where the very thing I depended on, my paycheck, would be used against me. But that's exactly what happened. And it all started with a boss who thought he could cut me down without consequences. My name is Olivia, and at the time, I was 25 years old, trying to keep my life together in a modest apartment while juggling bills, groceries, and the kind of expenses that always seem to come out of nowhere. I worked at a mid-sized company in the city, not glamorous, but steady. The kind of job you cling to because stability feels safer than risked. I had been there for almost 2 years, and during that time, I learned 2 things. First, I was good at my job. My reports were accurate, my projects finished on time, and even though I wasn't flashy, I was dependable. Second, my boss, Mr. Allen, didn't care about any of that. To him, people were pawns. Replaceable. And if you weren't one of his favorites, you were invisible. At first, I thought I could win him over. I worked extra hours. I volunteered to take shifts when others called in sick. I covered tasks that weren't even mine, just to prove I could handle responsibility. And sometimes, I thought I saw a flicker of acknowledgement, a quick nod when I handed in a flawless report, or a faint smile when I solved a problem before it grew into a crisis. But those flickers never lasted. Because in Mr. Allen's world, loyalty didn't come from hard work. It came from flattery, favors, and doing things his way, no matter how unfair. There was one employee in particular, let's call her Jessica, who could do no wrong in his eyes. She could stroll in late, leave early, or make mistakes that cost the company money, and he'd wave it off. She's learning, he'd say, or we all have off days. Meanwhile, if I was 5 minutes late for lunch because the line at the cafe stretched down the block, I'd get a pointed comment about time management. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a pattern. He liked having favorites because it kept the rest of us scrambling for approval. Divide and control. That was his style. I told myself I could handle it. After all, it was just a job, right? But the truth is, when you depend on that paycheck to keep the lights on, the job isn't just a job. It's survival. And that's why when Mr. Allen made his move, it hit harder than I ever expected. I remember the day vividly. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of day where nothing felt out of place. The office buzzed with quiet chatter, keyboards clicking, the hum of the old coffee machine in the corner. I was halfway through an expense report when he called me into his office. His tone was casual, almost friendly. "Olivia, take a seat," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. I thought maybe he was finally recognizing my work, perhaps even considering me for more responsibility. But instead, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said the words that turned my stomach cold, "We're going to have to cut your hours." At first, I thought I misheard him. "Excuse me?" He nodded, almost apologetically, though his eyes didn't match the tone. "Budget's tight. You understand. It's not personal." Not personal. But it felt very personal. Especially when, 2 hours later, I saw the new schedule posted and noticed Jessica had been given even more hours than before. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand an explanation. But instead, I stayed silent. I went back to my desk, stared at the numbers on my screen, and felt the weight of reality pressing down. My rent was due in 2 weeks. Groceries, utilities, everything piled up in my mind. Cutting my hours meant cutting my security. But I also knew something Mr. Allen didn't. I wasn't the type to roll over. And while I sat at my desk, pretending to type, I made a decision. If he thought cutting my hours would break me, he was wrong. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to whine. I was going to make him regret it. When Mr. Allen told me my hours were being cut, it was like someone had yanked the rug out from under me. At first, I thought maybe he meant it temporarily, just for a week or 2 until things stabilized. But when I saw the new schedule pinned on the corkboard in the break room, the reality hit me like a punch to the chest. There it was, in black and white, my hours slashed nearly in half. And right below my name? Jessica's. Her hours had gone up. Not just slightly, massively. The woman who could barely send an email without 3 typos was now working overtime, while I was scrambling to figure out how I'd pay my bills. I stared at the schedule for a good 5 minutes, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just about money, though that was the part that scared me the most. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Electricity. Internet. The groceries I stretched carefully across each paycheck. My budget was already tight. This cut wasn't just inconvenient, it was devastating. I remember walking back to my desk in a daze, trying to keep my face neutral. The last thing I wanted was to give Mr. Allen the satisfaction of seeing me upset. But inside, my emotions were a whirlwind. Anger, confusion, even betrayal. I had done everything right and shown up on time. Taken on extra tasks. Worked weekends when nobody else would. And for what? To be punished, while someone else who barely tried got rewarded? I glanced at Jessica as she breezed past my desk that afternoon. She gave me a little smirk, not overt, but enough to sting. It was like she knew she'd won somehow. That she'd secured her spot as Alan's golden child while I was left scrambling. What cut even deeper was the silence from my other coworkers. A few cast me sympathetic looks, sure, but nobody said anything. Nobody stood up for me. It was as if they'd already accepted the way things worked. Alan played favorites, and the rest of us just had to deal with it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, my bills spread out like little soldiers lined up to remind me of my responsibilities. I crunched the numbers over and over, hoping I'd made a mistake. But no matter how many times I redid the math, the truth didn't change. With my hours cut this drastically, I couldn't cover everything. I'd have to choose what to pay and what to delay, a dangerous game when late fees and penalties pile up fast. Sleep was impossible that night. My mind kept replaying the moment Alan said, "It's not personal." That phrase echoed like a taunt. Because to him, it wasn't personal. I was just a line on a budget sheet, an expendable worker he could shuffle around. But to me, this was my life. My survival. My dignity. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at Alan, but at myself. For working so hard to prove my worth to someone who clearly didn't care. For biting my tongue when I should have spoken up. For letting him think I'd just take this lying down. By the time the sun came up, my exhaustion had hardened into resolve. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. Not because I wanted pity or special treatment, but because I deserved fairness. And if Alan thought cutting my hours would quietly push me out the door, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The following week, I kept my head down. I worked the few hours I had with quiet efficiency. I didn't complain. I didn't argue. Outwardly, I looked like the model of compliance. But inside, I was already planning. Watching. Waiting. And then came the moment that changed everything. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out my employment contract. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe I was looking for some reassurance, some technicality that might help me. I expected to skim it and put it away again. But as my eyes scanned the fine print, one clause stopped me cold. Minimum guaranteed hours. Retroactive pay if reduced unfairly. I read it once. Twice. 3 times. My pulse quickened with each pass. Alan hadn't just cut my hours. He'd broken the contract. And if I played this right, I had him cornered. That realization was like a jolt of electricity. Suddenly, I wasn't the powerless employee scraping by. I had leverage. Real leverage. He thought he could slash my hours and leave me scrambling. But in his arrogance, he'd forgotten one crucial thing. I read the fine print. And that fine print was about to become my weapon. The night I pulled out my contract, I wasn't expecting to find salvation buried in the fine print, but desperation has a way of forcing you to look at things differently, and as I spread those papers across my kitchen table with a single dim lamp buzzing overhead, I felt like a detective chasing a clue no one else could see. Line by line I combed through the dull, formal language that I'd skimmed over the day I signed it, back when I thought this job was safe and steady, and then my eyes stopped cold on one paragraph, one I had never truly noticed before, which said that my position guaranteed a minimum of 35 hours a week, and that any reduction below that number, unless applied equally across the department, would entitle me to retroactive pay for the lost hours. My heart started racing, because suddenly everything Alan had done wasn't just unfair. It was illegal under the very contract he himself had signed. I sat back in my chair, contract trembling in my hands. And I couldn't help but smile for the first time in days, because the power dynamic had shifted without him realizing it, and now I wasn't just a struggling employee at his mercy, I was someone holding a hidden weapon he didn't know existed. Of course, power is only useful if you know how to use it, so I resisted the urge to march into his office the next morning waving the contract in his face, because that would have tipped my hand too soon, and instead I decided to play it smart, to build a paper trail so airtight that when the time came, there would be no wiggle room, no excuses, no way for him to wriggle free, and so I started documenting everything, every schedule posted, every hour assigned, every offhand email where he explained away the cuts with vague words like budget or realignment, and I kept it all neatly saved in a folder, both digital and physical, because if Alan had taught me anything, it was that he thrived on ambiguity and intimidation, and the only way to beat someone like that was with hard, undeniable proof. As the weeks passed, I became almost obsessive in my record-keeping, noting the hours Jessica worked compared to mine, printing timesheets, even logging conversations in a small notebook I carried with me, and while Alan strutted around the office thinking I had been silenced, thinking I had accepted my reduced role, I was quietly building a case strong enough to bury him. I still remember one Friday afternoon when he walked past my desk and said in that smug tone of his, "See, Olivia, everything's running smoother now that we've balanced the workload," and I bit my tongue to keep from laughing, because in that moment I realized he had no idea he was digging his own grave. Every smug comment, every favoritism shift toward Jessica, every schedule that blatantly broke the contract was another nail in his coffin, and the more confident he became, the stronger my case grew. I started to feel a strange calm settle over me, a confidence that came from knowing I wasn't powerless anymore, and that when the time came, I would strike in a way he couldn't anticipate. Late at night, when the apartment felt too quiet and my worries about bills crept back in, I reminded myself of that clause, of the simple line that promised me not just fairness but restitution, and I clung to it like a lifeline, because it wasn't just about money anymore, it was about justice, about turning his arrogance back on him, and that thought carried me through the hardest weeks. By the end of the month, my folder was thick with evidence, and all I needed was the right moment to act, the perfect time to drop the weight of it all onto HR's desk like a bomb they couldn't ignore. And as I lay in bed one night staring at the ceiling, I knew it was only a matter of time before Mr. Allen's smirk disappeared for good, because the girl he thought was too quiet to fight back was about to show him just how loud silence can be when it finally speaks. Once I understood what that contract clause meant, I realized my best weapon wasn't shouting or demanding justice, it was patience, and that patience would only pay off if I built a record so detailed and undeniable that when the moment came, my boss wouldn't be able to wiggle his way out with smooth words or fake apologies. So I began the slow and methodical process of creating what I like to call my paper trail. Though it wasn't just paper, it was everything: screenshots of schedules, printed copies of emails, photos of the breakroom corkboard where hours were posted, even text messages where Alan brushed me off with lines like budget issues or we all have to make sacrifices, which sounded noble until you looked at Jessica's 45-hour work week stacked right next to my pitiful 18, and I organized every single piece of evidence with meticulous care, labeling folders, keeping backups on a flash drive, even mailing copies to myself so there'd be a time-stamped record beyond his reach. The irony was, the quieter I became, the more reckless Alan grew, because in his mind, my silence equaled surrender, and week after week he doubled down, cutting my shifts further, piling projects onto Jessica while she rolled her eyes and bragged about how much overtime she was making, and every smug comment from him became another thread in the net I was weaving around him. I trained myself to smile politely whenever he announced changes in the break room, to nod when he made some offhand remark about team balance, and then, once I was alone, I would document, screenshot, and store it away like ammunition, because I knew one day soon I'd be pulling the trigger. Coworkers started whispering too, not loudly, but enough that I caught snatches like "she got cut again?" or "why does Jess keep getting all those hours?" And although nobody dared speak up, their murmurs fueled me. Because it meant I wasn't crazy, the unfairness was obvious to everyone, and all I had to do was be the one brave enough to prove it. One evening I even stayed late under the guise of finishing a report, but what I really did was copy the schedule history from the system, printing out 4 weeks' worth of records showing exactly how hours had been distributed, each page stamped with the system's automatic time and date, and when I tucked that stack of paper into my folder, I felt like I was holding his downfall in my hands. By the end of the month, my trail had grown thick enough to rival a novel, and flipping through it gave me this strange sense of calm power, because I knew the stronger it got, the less chance Alan had of escaping the consequences, and still, he had no idea. He walked around the office with his chest puffed out, barking orders, praising Jessica for work I secretly fixed behind the scenes, and treating me like some ghost he barely remembered, and it was almost laughable how blind he was to the storm brewing under his nose. The more arrogant he became, the more careful I was, never letting a trace of my plan show on my face, because I wanted the blow to hit him all at once, like thunder after lightning, impossible to ignore. There were moments, I admit, when I almost snapped, when his condescension made my blood boil so hot I wanted to throw the contract in his face and shout, "I've got you," but I bit down on my tongue and told myself, "Not yet, Olivia, not yet," because the trap is only worth it if it's airtight, and so I waited. Documented, organized, until the trail was no longer just a folder of evidence, it was a noose tightening slowly around his career, and when I finally chose to tighten it, I knew it would snap shut in a way he'd never forget. The day I finally decided to act felt like any other at first, quiet and ordinary, yet inside me there was a storm of focus and determination because I knew this was the day my silence ended. Weeks of gathering evidence, filing it neatly, building a record so strong it could hold up in court if necessary, all of it had been leading to this moment. I sat at my desk with my folder open beside me, the hum of the office filling the background like white noise, while Alan laughed with Jessica across the hall, oblivious to the fact that his empire of favoritism was about to crack. I opened a blank email and for a moment my fingers hovered above the keyboard, the weight of what I was about to do pressing on me, because once I sent it there would be no going back. I would be calling out my boss, not in whispers or private frustration but in writing, with evidence so sharp it could cut through all his excuses. I reminded myself this was not about revenge alone, it was about fairness, about protecting myself, about not letting him destroy my stability without consequence. And so I began typing. I wrote with a calm, professional tone, never once letting my anger bleed through because I knew HR would take it more seriously if I appeared measured and precise. Subject line: concern regarding contractual violation of minimum hours. Already the words felt heavy, undeniable. In the body of the email, I outlined the situation with clear facts, no emotion, no accusations, just the truth. I explained how my hours had been reduced below the contractual minimum, attached a copy of the clause from my contract, and then included evidence of the schedules showing not only my reduced hours but the increased hours given to Jessica. I attached copies of Alan's vague emails citing budget and resource realignment, carefully pointing out the inconsistencies and the favoritism without ever naming it as such. My words were simple but devastating. According to my contract, these actions constitute a breach, entitling me to retroactive compensation for lost hours and reinstatement of my guaranteed minimum. I closed by requesting confirmation of corrective measures and a timeline for resolution. Before I hit send, I read the email 3 times, adjusting words, tightening sentences, making sure nothing could be dismissed as emotional or exaggerated. Each sentence was a hammer, each attachment a nail, and by the time I finished, the coffin of Alan's credibility was sealed. My finger hovered over the mouse for a moment as my heart raced. Then, with one steady breath, I clicked send. The email whooshed out, copied to HR, copied to Alan himself. And just like that, the silence I had worn like armor for weeks shattered into action. The next few hours felt like waiting for an earthquake you knew was coming. Every time my email notification pinged I jolted, half expecting a furious response from Alan. Instead, the first reply came from HR, short but powerful: "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We are reviewing the matter and will follow up shortly." Polite, neutral, but enough to let me know the wheels were turning. I glanced across the office at Alan. He was still joking with Jessica, still completely unaware. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment, like watching someone laugh while standing on a trapdoor that was about to swing open. Almost. By late afternoon, the storm hit. Alan marched past my desk, red-faced, clutching his phone, clearly having read the email that exposed him. His jaw clenched, his voice low as he barked, "My office. Now." But for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I had the truth on my side, and more importantly, I had proof. I stood calmly, followed him into his office, and sat across from him while he paced like a cornered animal. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. I looked him in the eye and simply said, "I stood up for what's in my contract." That silenced him. He knew it was true. He knew I had him. Minutes later, his phone buzzed again. HR wanted a formal meeting. Tomorrow. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining from his face, and for the first time since I had known him, Alan looked small. I walked out of his office with my head high, the tension in my chest finally lifting. The bomb had been dropped, and there was no stopping the fallout now. The morning of the meeting I woke up with a knot in my stomach, not from fear but from anticipation, because I knew this was the day everything would come to a head, the day Alan would finally have to answer for what he had done, and as I got ready I kept repeating to myself that the truth was on my side, that the folder of evidence sitting in my bag was more powerful than any excuse he could invent. When I arrived at the office, HR had already reserved a conference room, a long table in the middle, blinds half drawn, the kind of space that felt heavy with seriousness. Alan was already there, his face tight, his eyes narrowed as he tapped his pen against the table like he was trying to drum up confidence, but I could see through him now. I could see the cracks in his armor. Across from us sat Ms. Peters from HR, her expression neutral but sharp, the kind of person who missed nothing, and beside her was a junior HR rep with a laptop open, ready to take notes. I sat down calmly, laid my folder in front of me, and waited. Ms. Peters began, her tone steady, explaining that this was a formal review of my concerns regarding hours and contractual obligations, and she invited Alan to speak first. He launched into a speech I had expected, talking about budgets and company pressures, about the need to redistribute resources fairly, all while carefully avoiding the fact that one employee had been consistently favored at my expense. He gestured, he leaned forward, he tried to sound authoritative, but as the words spilled out they sounded more and more hollow, because I knew and HR knew that facts would trump theatrics. When he finished, Ms. Peters turned to me, and that was my cue. I opened my folder slowly, deliberately, and slid the first document across the table, a printed copy of my contract with the clause highlighted in yellow. "This is the section that guarantees me a minimum of 35 hours per week," I said calmly, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. Then I laid down the schedules, one by one, showing week after week of my hours cut to 18, sometimes even less, while Jessica's soared past 40. I pointed out the dates, the signatures, the timestamps, and then added copies of Alan's emails that referenced budget issues without ever applying cuts equally across the team. As I spoke, I noticed Ms. Peters leaning in, her eyes scanning each page carefully, her pen scribbling notes, while Alan shifted uncomfortably, his pen now still, his confidence evaporating. I didn't need to raise my voice, I didn't need to attack him, because the evidence spoke louder than anger ever could. When I finished, the room was silent except for the faint tapping of keys from the HR rep. Ms. Peters looked at Alan and asked simply, "How do you explain these discrepancies?" For the first time since I had worked under him, Alan had no answer ready. He stammered, he tried to blame scheduling software, then claimed Jessica had unique qualifications that required more hours, but every excuse fell flat against the clarity of the documents in front of us. Ms. Peters pressed him, asking why other employees had not been given equal opportunities if this was truly about skills, and why he had not filed the proper budget reduction paperwork if cuts were necessary across the department. The more he tried to wriggle free, the deeper he sank, and watching it happen felt like justice unfolding in real time. At one point, he turned to me, his eyes blazing, and said, "You should have come to me first," as if the betrayal was mine, but I met his gaze and replied softly, "I did what the contract required, and now I'm doing what fairness requires." That shut him down completely. Ms. Peters cleared her throat and announced that, based on the evidence, I was entitled to retroactive pay for the weeks my hours had been unlawfully reduced, as well as reinstatement of my guaranteed minimum hours immediately. She also said HR would be conducting a broader review of scheduling practices in our department to ensure compliance moving forward. The words landed like thunder, each one a blow Alan couldn't dodge, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small smile. The meeting ended with formalities, promises of follow-up emails, and HR thanking me for my professionalism, but as I gathered my folder and walked out of that conference room, the feeling that washed over me wasn't just relief, it was triumph, the quiet kind of triumph that comes from knowing you fought back without lowering yourself to their level, that you let the truth do the talking. Alan stayed behind, slumped in his chair, looking older, smaller, stripped of the authority he once wielded like a weapon, and I knew this was only the beginning of his reckoning. In the days that followed the meeting, the fallout was impossible to ignore, because while HR worked behind the scenes to process my retroactive pay and adjust the schedules, the atmosphere in the office shifted in a way I had never seen before, a quiet ripple of realization moving through my coworkers as they saw the changes unfold and recognized that Alan was no longer untouchable. The first sign came when the new schedule was posted on Monday morning. My hours had been restored to the full 35 minimum, just as the contract required, while Jessica's bloated overtime was slashed down to normal levels, and I noticed her confused frown as she stared at the board, her lips parting like she wanted to complain but knew better than to say anything. Alan avoided eye contact with everyone that day, his usual booming voice subdued, his comments clipped, as though the very act of speaking risked unraveling what little authority he had left. And then came the email from HR, not just to me but to the entire department, a carefully worded message announcing that moving forward, all schedules will adhere to contractual minimums and maximums to ensure fairness and compliance, which might have sounded neutral to an outsider, but to those of us who had lived under Alan's favoritism, it was a thinly veiled indictment, a public declaration that he had been caught and corrected. The whispers started soon after, co-workers leaning over cubicles, murmuring about how Alan had been forced into a corner, about how it was me, quiet Olivia, who had finally stood up to him, and though no one said it loudly, I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, not with pity anymore but with a kind of respect, the kind reserved for someone who had dared to do what they all wished they could. HR processed my retroactive pay within 2 weeks, a lump sum that nearly made me cry when I saw it land in my bank account, because it meant I could breathe again, pay off the rent, stock my fridge, and still have enough to set aside for the first time in months. But the money, as vital as it was, wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching Alan's empire crumble around him. Projects he once controlled were reassigned to other managers. Meetings he used to dominate were now led by HR representatives who emphasized transparency and fairness. Even his relationship with Jessica shifted, the favoritism cooling into distance as if he had been told to keep things professional or risk further scrutiny. And every day, when I walked past his office and saw him hunched over his desk, shoulders tight, eyes darting nervously whenever someone knocked on his door, I knew the backfire was complete. He had tried to cut me down, to weaken me, to make me disappear quietly, but instead, his actions had detonated in his own hands, blowing holes in his reputation, his authority, and his comfort. Some part of me almost felt sorry for him, watching him shrink in stature day by day, but then I remembered the sleepless nights I had spent calculating bills, the humiliation of being sidelined while Jessica flaunted her extra hours, the quiet smirks and dismissive tones, and any sympathy I felt dissolved into satisfaction. This wasn't cruelty. This was a consequence. He had underestimated me, underestimated the power of a single line in a contract, underestimated the strength that comes from refusing to be silenced, and in doing so, he had orchestrated his own downfall. My revenge hadn't required yelling or plotting behind his back or trying to embarrass him in front of the team. All it had taken was patience, proof, and the courage to act when the time was right. That was the beauty of it, the part that made the victory so sweet. He had written the rules, and I had simply used them better than he did.